The Vanishing Hitchhiker. I swear I didn't imagine it. This really happened to me. It was around midnight, and I was driving back home from a weekend camping trip with my two friends, Emma and Jake. The highway stretched endlessly ahead, swallowed in darkness, the only sounds coming from the car's engine and the faint static of the radio. We were all tired, eager to get home, when suddenly, out of nowhere, the headlights caught something on the side of the road. It was a girl. She looked young, maybe in her 20s, with long dark hair hanging in damp strands around her pale face. She was holding a small backpack and had her thumb out, clearly hitchhiking. I felt an immediate pang of hesitation, but Emma was already nudging me. "We can't just leave her out here," she said. Jake, who was driving, groaned. "This feels like the start of a bad horror movie." But he slowed down anyway. When we stopped, the girl walked up to the car without a word and got into the back seat next to Emma. Her presence was unsettling. She murmured a quiet, "Thank you," barely audible, and then gave us an address a few miles ahead. As we started driving again, I tried to break the awkward silence. "Were you out here long?" I asked her. She just shook her head, staring out the window. Her hands clutched her backpack so tightly that her knuckles were white. I exchanged a glance with Emma, who shrugged, but we both felt it. Something wasn't right. We drove for what felt like forever, though it was probably just a few minutes. The tension in the car was suffocating. Then we reached the spot she'd mentioned, a small clearing near a cluster of trees. Jake slowed down. "Is this it?" No response. Emma turned to her, and her gasp made me whip around. The girl was gone. She hadn't made a sound, no door opening, no rustle of movement. The seatbelt was still buckled, but the seat was empty. "What the hell?" Jake said, pulling the car over. We all got out, scanning the area with our phone flashlights. The road was empty, the woods silent. It was like she had vanished into thin air. When we climbed back into the car, that's when I saw it. Scratched into the fogged-up window of the back seat were 3 words. "Don't trust him." Jake immediately locked the doors and started driving, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. "We didn't see that earlier, right?" he asked, his voice shaky. "No," Emma said, barely above a whisper. "It wasn't there before." As we sped down the highway, every shadow on the roadside seemed to stretch toward us, every tree bending closer. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The rest of the drive was suffocatingly silent. Even the radio seemed too loud, and Jake turned it off completely. I kept glancing at the back seat, half expecting her to reappear. When we finally got home, I inspected the car again. The scratch marks were still there, faint but unmistakable. None of us could explain it, and we didn't want to. To this day, I don't know what it meant, or who she was warning us about. But one thing is for sure, I'll never pick up another hitchhiker again. The Endless Highway. It was supposed to be a quick drive to a weekend getaway. Lisa and I had been looking forward to it for months, just a simple escape from the city stress. The highway stretched ahead, bathed in the fading hues of a late evening sky. Everything seemed normal, at least at first. But then, we noticed something strange. "Didn't we just pass that diner?" Lisa asked, pointing to a retro-style building with a neon sign flickering, "Open 24 hours." I glanced at her, then at the diner and shrugged. "Maybe they have a chain. You know how these places are." She nodded, but a faint unease crept into her voice. "Yeah, maybe." We kept driving. The sky darkened, and the road ahead seemed to stretch endlessly. That's when I noticed the diner again. The same diner, same flickering neon sign, same cracked parking lot with the same old truck parked out front. "No way," Lisa whispered. "That's not a chain." I tried to rationalize it. Maybe we'd turned around without realizing. Maybe the GPS had glitched. but deep down, I knew something was off. Determined to prove it was all in our heads, I pulled over near the diner and stepped out. The air was unnaturally still, like the world had paused around us. As I approached the diner, my footsteps echoed louder than they should have on the cracked asphalt. Peering inside the window, I saw no movement, just empty booths and a lone cup of coffee steaming on the counter. I backed away and returned to the car. "Let's just keep driving," I said. Lisa didn't argue. The landmarks began to repeat, not just the diner, but a gas station, an old barn, even a faded billboard advertising a local radio station. Each time we passed, they seemed slightly different. The barn's windows shattered. The gas station's lights flickered ominously. The billboard's smiling faces began to look distorted, their eyes too large and their smiles too wide. "We're stuck," Lisa said, gripping the dashboard. "We're not getting out of here." Her panic was infectious, but I forced myself to stay calm. "We just need to keep going. There has to be an exit somewhere." But as we kept driving, the landmarks grew more surreal. The diner was now completely dark, its neon sign shattered. The gas station pumps were torn from the ground, hoses dangling like severed limbs. The barn was in flames, black smoke billowing into the starless sky. Worst of all, the billboard now showed a picture of us. The same clothes we were wearing, the same terrified expressions on our faces. Beneath it, in bold letters, it read, "You'll never leave." Lisa screamed, and I hit the gas, speeding faster than I ever had. The road began to twist unnaturally, looping in impossible curves and sharp turns that defied logic. My hands ached from gripping the wheel, my knuckles white. "Look!" Lisa shouted, pointing ahead. In the distance, a faint glow appeared, a break in the endless night. I floored it, desperate to reach it. The car roared forward, and just as we reached the light, there was a blinding flash. The next thing I knew, we were parked at the edge of a quiet town. The highway was gone, replaced by a narrow dirt road. Lisa and I sat in stunned silence, unsure how we'd gotten there or what had just happened. We didn't talk about it as we checked into the nearest motel, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd only escaped by chance, and that the highway was still out there, waiting for its next victims. The abandoned gas station. It was a quiet stretch of highway, miles from anywhere. My family and I were on a road trip, heading to a remote cabin for some much-needed time away. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the empty road. That's when the gas light came on. "Perfect," I muttered. My wife, Claire, glanced at me from the passenger seat, and our two kids, Max and Sophie, groaned from the back. "We'll stop at the next station," I reassured them. It wasn't long before a flickering neon sign came into view. "Gas, food, open 24 hours." The place looked old, like it had been plucked straight from the 1950s and left untouched. A rusted sign swayed gently in the breeze, creaking with every gust of wind. I pulled in and the car crunched over gravel. The pumps were those ancient ones with spinning dials instead of digital screens. A small building stood beside them, its windows glowing faintly with a warm yellow light. "I'll fill up," I said, stepping out of the car. The air was oddly still, the kind of silence that presses on your ears. I grabbed the pump and started fueling. That's when the door to the station creaked open. Two attendants stepped out, both dressed in pristine uniforms that looked decades out of date. One was an older man, his face weathered but strangely smooth, his eyes unblinking. The other was a young woman, her hair styled in tight curls and pinned back with a red ribbon. "Evening," the man said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. Evening," I replied, trying not to stare. Claire got out of the car, stretching. "Do you have a restroom?" she asked. "Inside," the woman said, her smile too wide. Claire hesitated, but nodded and headed toward the building. Max and Sophie stayed in the car, playing on their tablets, blissfully unaware of how strange everything felt. As I finished fueling, I glanced at the attendants again. Something about them was off. The way they stood, perfectly still, like mannequins. The way their eyes never blinked. I decided to pay quickly and get out of there. As I walked toward the building, I noticed the prices on the pump. They were absurdly low, like they hadn't changed since the 1960s. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of dust and stale coffee. The shelves were stocked with faded cans and boxes, their labels yellowed and peeling. Claire stood near the restroom, looking uneasy. "Let's hurry," I said, handing a 20 to the man behind the counter. He took it without a word, his fingers cold and clammy when they brushed mine. "You're not from around here," he said, his voice sending a chill down my spine. "No, just passing through," I replied, trying to sound casual. "Better keep passing through," the woman added, her smile never faltering. Claire grabbed my arm. "Let's go." We walked briskly back to the car. As we climbed in, I glanced back at the station. The attendants were standing outside again, watching us. Their faces seemed different. Younger, smoother, like the years had peeled away in the few minutes we'd been inside. I threw the car into gear and sped off. In the rearview mirror, the station began to fade into the distance, but as we drove, I noticed something chilling. The needle on the gas gauge hadn't moved. We drove for hours, but the unease lingered. When we finally reached the cabin, I told Claire what I'd noticed. "We fueled up, but it didn't register," I said. She shuddered. "Maybe it's better that way. Something about that place wasn't natural." We never spoke of it again, but to this day I wonder, was it the gas station that hadn't aged, or was it something else entirely? And what would have happened if we'd stayed any longer? The phantom truck. It was past midnight, and the road stretched ahead of us like a ribbon through the darkness. My friends and I were on a road trip, eager to reach our next stop before exhaustion took over. The highway was eerily quiet, the only sounds the hum of our engine and the faint rustle of wind through the open windows. "Maybe we should have stopped at that last motel," Sarah muttered from the passenger seat, her eyes darting nervously to the empty road ahead. "We're fine," I said, forcing a smile. "Just a couple more hours." From the back seat, Mark yawned. "I'll take over if you get tired." The road ahead was deserted, with not a single car in sight. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds, casting the highway in near total darkness. That's when we heard it, a low, distant rumble like the growl of an approaching storm. "Is that thunder?" Sarah asked, leaning forward. Before I could answer, a pair of blinding headlights appeared in the rearview mirror, growing larger and brighter at an alarming speed. "It's a truck," Mark said, "and it's coming up fast." I shifted lanes to let it pass, but instead of overtaking us, the truck loomed closer, its horn blaring like a banshee's wail. The sound sent shivers down my spine. "What the hell is their problem?" I muttered, gripping the wheel tightly. The truck's headlights filled the car, so bright they washed out everything else. I couldn't even see the driver's cab, just those searing lights and the massive chrome grille bearing down on us. "Speed up!" Sarah yelled, panic in her voice. I pressed the gas and the engine roared as we surged forward. The truck followed, matching our speed effortlessly. Its horn blared again, louder and more menacing. Mark twisted around in his seat. "I don't see a driver." "What do you mean?" I shouted, glancing in the mirror. "There's no one in the cab," he insisted. My heart pounded as I focused on the road ahead, my hands slick with sweat. The truck seemed to toy with us, surging forward as if to ram us before falling back just enough to keep us on edge. Sarah fumbled with her phone. "I'm calling the police," she said, her voice shaking. But when she tried, the screen flickered and went black. "What? No signal?" The truck's horn blared again, a deafening sound that seemed to echo in my skull. I swerved onto an exit ramp, desperate to escape. The ramp led to a narrow, winding road, but the truck followed, its massive frame somehow navigating the tight turns with ease. "Is this even real?" Mark whispered. The road curved sharply, and for a moment the truck disappeared from view. I breathed a sigh of relief, thinking we'd lost it, but then it appeared again, this time ahead of us. "How is that possible?" Sarah screamed. The truck was motionless, its headlights dark, but as we approached, the lights flared to life, and it surged toward us. "Hold on!" I yelled, yanking the wheel to the side. The car skidded off the road and into a patch of dirt. We came to a stop, breathing hard, our hearts pounding. When I looked back at the road, the truck was gone. "What just happened?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't know," I said, still gripping the wheel. We sat there for a long moment, too scared to move. Finally, I restarted the car and got back on the highway, driving cautiously. The rest of the night passed without incident, but the memory of that truck haunted us. To this day, I can still hear that horn in my nightmares, and every time I drive down a dark highway, I check the rearview mirror, half expecting to see those blinding headlights chasing me again. The haunting rest. Stop. It was late, and the highway stretched endlessly before us. The miles blurred together, and fatigue weighed heavily on all of us. When the dim lights of a rest stop appeared on the horizon, it felt like salvation. "I need to stretch my legs," Sarah said, breaking the silence. "Me too," Mark added from the back seat, already gathering his jacket. I pulled into the lot, which was nearly deserted except for a single flickering streetlight. The building looked old, its faded sign barely legible. The air was unnaturally still as we stepped out of the car, the silence broken only by the hum of the lights overhead. The rest stop's interior was eerily quiet, with fluorescent lights casting a harsh glow. A faint smell of mildew lingered in the air. We decided to use the restroom quickly and get back on the road. The men's room was cold, and the tiled walls amplified every sound. I was washing my hands when I noticed something odd, faint smudges on the mirror. At first, I thought they were just streaks from poor cleaning, but as I leaned closer, I realized they weren't random. They were symbols, circles, lines, and strange patterns etched faintly into the glass. "Mark?" I called, my voice echoing. "What?" he replied, emerging from one of the stalls. "Do you see this?" I pointed to the mirror. He stepped closer and squinted. "Weird? Maybe graffiti?" Before I could respond, the lights flickered, plunging the room into momentary darkness. When they came back on, the symbols on the mirror were more prominent, as if freshly drawn. "Okay, that's creepy," Mark muttered, backing away. In the women's restroom, Sarah emerged looking pale. "Did you see the mirrors?" she asked, her voice shaky. "You too?" I asked. She nodded. "They had these symbols. And when I tried to wipe them off, I thought I saw a face behind me in the glass." We exchanged uneasy glances, but brushed it off as exhaustion playing tricks on us. Deciding not to linger, we grabbed some snacks from the vending machine and headed back to the car. As I started the engine, I glanced at the rearview mirror and froze. For a split second, I thought I saw someone standing in the restroom doorway, a shadowy figure that disappeared when I blinked. The highway seemed darker as we drove on, the rest stopped fading into the distance, but the unease lingered. Then the strange things began. Sarah gasped, staring out her window. "Did you see that?" "See what?" Mark and I asked in unison. "There was someone standing by the side of the road. I swear it looked like the person I saw in the mirror." Mark leaned forward. "It's just your imagination." But then he went silent, staring at the passenger side mirror. "What?" I asked. "There's something behind us," he whispered. I glanced at the rearview mirror again. This time I saw them. Figures walking along the road in the darkness, their shapes barely illuminated by the tail lights. When I turned around to look directly, The road was empty. "Keep driving," Sarah said, her voice trembling. The rest of the trip passed in tense silence, with none of us daring to look back. When we reached our destination, we checked the car, hoping to shake off the lingering fear. But what we found made our blood run cold. Scratched into the dust on the rear window were the same symbols we had seen on the mirrors at the rest stop. We never stopped there again, and I'll never forget the oppressive silence, the strange symbols, and the haunting figures. Some places aren't meant for weary travelers to rest. They're meant to trap them forever. The Cursed Road Map. The road trip started like any other, a mix of excitement and wanderlust. I was rummaging through a box of old books and trinkets at a roadside antique shop when I found it. An aged road map tucked between dusty atlases. Its creases were deep and the paper felt brittle. The handwritten title across the top read, "Paths Less Traveled." Something about it intrigued me, so I bought it for a few bucks and tossed it onto the passenger seat before heading back to the highway. Curiosity got the better of me a couple of hours later. The map was detailed, marking small, forgotten towns and winding roads that weren't on my GPS. One place in particular caught my eye, a town called Black Hollow. The name wasn't on any modern map, but the route to get there was clear on the old one. Feeling adventurous, I decided to take the detour. The road to Black Hollow was narrow and overgrown, as if it hadn't been used in decades. The air seemed heavier, the trees crowding in on either side, blocking out the sun. My radio cut out, leaving only the hum of the tires and the occasional rustle of leaves. When I arrived, the town was eerily quiet. The buildings were weathered and abandoned, their windows dark and empty. A single gas station stood at the edge of town, its pumps rusted and useless. Something about the place made my skin crawl, but I couldn't resist exploring. As I wandered the streets, I noticed faded posters on the walls with messages like, "Do not trust the map," and "Leave before it's too late." I hurried back to the car, unease settling in my chest. When I opened the door, the map was no longer on the passenger seat. It was spread out on the dashboard, as if it had been waiting for me. Another town was now circled in red, Hollow Creek. I hadn't circled it, and I certainly hadn't noticed it before. I tried crumpling the map, but the paper resisted, feeling almost alive beneath my fingers. I threw it in the glove compartment and decided to leave Black Hollow behind. But no matter which direction I drove, the road looped back to the town. Frustrated and panicking, I opened the glove compartment to find the map perfectly smoothed out, as if mocking me. "Fine," I muttered, deciding to follow its lead. The road to Hollow Creek was even more foreboding, with signs warning of danger. "Turn back now, and beware the cursed road." When I reached the town, it was even more decrepit than Black Hollow. The streets were littered with debris, and the air was thick with an unnatural fog. Shadows flickered at the edges of my vision, but when I turned to look, there was nothing there. In the center of town stood an old church. Its doors creaked open, as if inviting me inside. Against my better judgment, I stepped in, finding the map spread out on the altar. This time, another location was circled, one I didn't recognize but felt an overwhelming dread just looking at it. I tried burning the map, but the flames refused to catch. Tearing it was equally futile. It was as if the map had claimed me, binding me to its cursed journey. I fled the church, got into my car, and drove as fast as I could. The roads twisted endlessly, leading me back to the same cursed towns again and again. I don't know how long I've been driving. Days? Weeks? The map never leaves my sight, and every time I try to escape, it leads me to darker places. If you ever find an old road map with forgotten towns, leave it where you found it. Some roads are meant to stay lost forever. The Crying Passenger. It was one of those nights when the rain poured so hard it blurred the road ahead, and thunder cracked loud enough to rattle the car windows. My friends and I were on a road trip trying to reach the next town before midnight. The storm was relentless, and the dark, winding highway felt endless. Then, out of nowhere, our headlights caught a small figure standing by the roadside. It was a child, soaking wet, clutching a small backpack and shivering. The sight of someone so young, alone in the middle of nowhere, made my stomach turn. "Stop," I said instinctively. My friends hesitated. "Are you sure?" one of them asked. "It's weird. A kid out here in this storm?" But I couldn't just drive past. We pulled over and I rolled down the window. "Hey there," I called out. "Are you okay? Do you need a ride?" The child looked up, their face pale and streaked with rainwater. Or was it tears? "Please," they whispered, their voice barely audible over the storm. "I need to get home." I opened the back door, and the child climbed in silently, water pooling under their shoes. They didn't offer a name, just sat there clutching their backpack, staring out the window. At first, we tried to make conversation. "Where's your home? What were you doing out there?" The child's answers were brief and vague, never revealing much. As we drove, the air in the car grew colder, as if the storm had seeped inside. I glanced in the rearview mirror and caught the child staring directly at me, their dark eyes unblinking. My stomach churned. "We're almost there," I said, though I had no idea where there was. I just wanted to get this over with. That's when the crying started. Soft at first, like a whimper, but it quickly grew louder, more guttural, almost inhuman. My friend in the passenger seat turned around. "Hey, are you okay?" The child didn't answer. Instead, they began to hum a strange, discordant tune that sent chills down my spine. The sound was unnatural, like multiple voices layered on top of each other. "Pull over," my friend whispered urgently. I nodded, heart racing, and pulled to the side of the road. Before I could say anything, the child stopped humming and looked up, their face no longer pale and innocent but twisted, with dark hollows where their eyes had been. "You shouldn't have stopped," they said, their voice echoing unnaturally. The car doors wouldn't open. My friends and I were trapped as the temperature plummeted. Frost crept up the windows, and the storm outside seemed to vanish, leaving only an oppressive silence. The child, or whatever it was, leaned forward, grinning now, and whispered, "Thank you for the ride. You'll never make it home." Suddenly, the lights in the car flickered and everything went dark. When I came to, I was alone in the driver's seat, the storm raging again outside. My friends were gone. The back seat was empty except for a single soaking wet backpack. I didn't dare open it. To this day, I don't know what I picked up that night. But every now and then, when I'm driving in the rain, I hear that same strange humming and feel cold air brush the back of my neck. The disappearing convoy. Road trips in a convoy always felt like a safety net. There's comfort in knowing someone's just a car length behind you, especially when you're on isolated highways late at night. That's what made it all the more chilling when one of the cars in our group vanished. It was a crisp fall evening, and our group of friends had split between 3 cars to make the drive to a cabin in the mountains. I was in the lead car, with 2 friends riding along, while the others followed close behind. Every few miles, we'd check in over the walkie-talkies we brought for fun, cracking jokes and sharing updates on the road ahead. Everything was fine until we hit a stretch of road that was unusually dark. There were no streetlights, no roadside signs, just endless asphalt flanked by shadowy trees. The static over the walkie-talkie grew louder, cutting into the banter. "Hey, slow down a bit," came a crackling voice from the middle car. "You're getting too far ahead." I glanced at my rearview mirror, seeing their headlights not far behind. "Got it," I replied, easing off the gas. "Everyone still good back there?" The third car answered quickly. "We're here, right behind you." We continued in silence for a while, the mood growing tense as the road seemed to stretch on forever. Then, without warning, the voice from the third car broke the silence. "Uh, guys, where's the second car?" I frowned and glanced in the mirror again. Sure enough, only one set of headlights trailed us now. "What do you mean?" "They're right there." I paused, realizing I could no longer see the middle car. "They were just behind me," said the driver of the last car, her voice trembling. "Now they're gone." I grabbed the walkie-talkie. "Hey, second car, come in. Where are you?" Static. We pulled over to the shoulder, waiting for the second car to catch up. Minutes passed. No headlights, no response. I called their cell phones. No answer. Panic set in. We retraced our route, driving slowly and scanning the roadside for any sign of them. Nothing. No tire marks, no skid marks, no signs of a crash. It was as if their car had evaporated into thin air. "Maybe they took a wrong turn," one of my friends suggested weakly. But we all knew that wasn't possible. There hadn't been any intersections or turnoffs for miles. Then, as we turned back onto the highway, the static on the walkie-talkie crackled again. A faint voice cut through, almost too garbled to understand. "Help! Lost!" It was them. "Where are you?" I yelled into the device, gripping it tightly. "Dark! Can't see!" The voice faded, replaced by an unsettling hum. We stopped the car again, stepping out into the cold night air, calling their names into the void. The silence that answered was deafening. The remaining group huddled together, unsure of what to do. Finally, we decided to keep driving, hoping they'd reappear at the cabin or find another way to reach us. But when we arrived, there was no sign of them. The next day, we contacted the police. They searched the area extensively but found no trace of the car or our friends. No one could explain how an entire vehicle could disappear without a trace on an open road. To this day, the memory haunts me. Every time I drive at night, I find myself glancing nervously in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see those headlights again. Or worse, for them to vanish all over again. The Ghost Town Detour. It was supposed to be a straightforward drive, a scenic route through the countryside to our weekend getaway. But when our GPS lost signal and rerouted us, we ended up taking a detour that none of us could have anticipated. The detour took us down a narrow, unmarked road that wound through dense woods. As twilight set in, we emerged into what looked like an old, forgotten town. The buildings were weathered, their paint peeling, and the streets were eerily empty. A rusty sign at the entrance read, "Welcome to Still Hollow." "Looks abandoned," my friend Lisa said from the back seat, peering out the window. "Probably just a small town no one visits anymore," I replied, though I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling settling in my chest. We decided to stop briefly to stretch our legs and figure out how to get back to the main road. Parking in what seemed to be the town square, we stepped out into the silent evening. A dry wind blew through the empty streets, rustling brittle leaves along the cracked pavement. "It's like a ghost town," said Mark, another friend, snapping a picture of the faded storefronts. It certainly felt that way. There were no cars, no lights, no sign of life anywhere. Yet, as I stood there, I couldn't shake the sensation of being watched. Lisa pointed to a diner across the square, its faded neon sign flickering weakly. "Let's check it out. Maybe there's someone inside." Reluctantly, we agreed. The door creaked loudly as we pushed it open. Inside, the diner looked frozen in time, with old red booths, a dusty jukebox, and half-filled coffee cups sitting on the counter as if the patrons had just stepped out. "Hello?" I called, my voice echoing. No answer. The uneasiness deepened as the sun dipped below the horizon. The town seemed darker than it should have been, the shadows unnaturally deep. That's when Lisa pointed out something chilling. The coffee in one of the cups was still steaming. "That's not possible," she whispered, backing away. Before we could respond, the jukebox crackled to life, playing an old, scratchy tune. We froze, glancing at each other in disbelief. Then came the faint sound of footsteps outside, shuffling in the gravel. Mark peeked through the window, his face turning pale. "Guys, we need to leave. Now." "What is it?" I asked. But before he could answer, we heard it too. A low, guttural whispering that seemed to come from all around us. Lisa screamed, pointing at the diner window. Figures were emerging from the shadows, pale, gaunt, and unnervingly still as they stared at us with hollow, unblinking eyes. We bolted for the car, the figures moving closer, their steps slow but deliberate. I fumbled with the keys, finally managing to start the engine. As we sped away, the headlights illuminated dozens more of those ghostly figures lining the road, their heads slowly turning to follow our car. The GPS finally regained signal as we exited the town, and the voice calmly directed us back to the highway. None of us spoke for a long time, the tension thick in the air. When we finally reached our destination, we tried looking up Still Hollow, but there was no record of it anywhere. No mention of a town by that name, no maps showing its location. To this day, we don't know what we stumbled into. All I know is that I'll never trust a detour again. The Bridge to Nowhere. It started as an adventure, a chance to explore some of the lesser-known routes on our road trip. We were deep in the countryside when we came across a rickety old bridge that wasn't marked on the map. It spanned a narrow, mist-covered river, the kind of scene you'd see in a forgotten postcard. The wooden planks creaked as we slowed the car to a stop at the entrance. A faded sign, barely legible through years of wear, read, "Cross at your own risk." "Is this safe?" Lisa asked, leaning forward from the back seat. "Looks sketchy, but it's probably fine," Mark replied, though his voice lacked conviction. The bridge didn't look fine. The wood was weathered, some planks visibly warped, and the railings barely hung on by rusted nails. But turning back would mean hours of detours. Against my better judgment, I eased the car onto the bridge. The planks groaned under the car's weight, the sound amplified in the eerie silence. Beneath us, the dark water seemed to ripple unnaturally, as if something just beneath the surface was moving. Halfway across, the fog thickened. It wasn't the usual kind of mist. It clung to the bridge like a living thing, coiling around the car and obscuring everything beyond the headlights. "This doesn't feel right," Lisa murmured, her voice tense. I nodded but kept driving. The bridge felt endless, as though we were trapped in a loop. Finally, the fog began to thin, and we reached the other side. But something was off. The landscape before us wasn't the same as the one we'd left. The trees were taller, their branches gnarled and reaching toward the sky like skeletal fingers. The grass was an unnatural shade of green, almost glowing in the dim light. The air felt heavier, as though we had stepped into a different world. "Where are we?" Mark asked, but none of us had an answer. We drove for what felt like hours, but the road didn't seem to lead anywhere. The landmarks were strange: an old farmhouse with no windows, a rusted swing set that moved on its own in the still air, and a scarecrow with hollow eyes that seemed to follow us as we passed. Then we noticed the clock on the dashboard. It hadn't moved. "It's broken," Lisa said, checking her phone. But her phone was frozen too. No time, no signal, no anything. Panic started to set in. We decided to turn around and head back to the bridge, but the road twisted and turned, refusing to lead us where we wanted to go. The landmarks started repeating, but they weren't the same anymore. The farmhouse was now charred, its roof collapsed. The swing set's seats hung by a thread, swaying more violently. And the scarecrow, it was gone. "Just keep driving," Mark urged, his voice shaking. Finally, the bridge appeared ahead, shrouded in the same ominous mist. We crossed as quickly as possible, the car tires screeching over the old wood. As soon as we reached the other side, the fog dissipated, and the familiar landscape of the countryside reappeared. Relief washed over us, but it was short-lived. The clock on the dashboard suddenly started working again, showing a time 3 hours later than it should have been. And our phones lit up with missed calls and messages, all asking where we had been. We tried to find the bridge again the next day, but it was gone. The river was there, but no sign of any structure crossing it. Whatever that place was, we weren't meant to find it. And we'll never take a road less traveled again. The stalker in the rear view. It was late, and the stretch of highway we were on seemed to go on forever, lit only by our headlights and the occasional flicker of a distant street lamp. Mark was driving, Lisa was in the back seat scrolling through her phone, and I sat in the passenger seat, staring out at the empty road. We were halfway through our road trip and looking forward to reaching the next motel for some much-needed rest. "Anyone else notice how quiet it is?" Lisa asked, breaking the silence. I nodded. "Not a single car for miles. Feels like we're the only ones out here." Mark glanced at the rearview mirror and frowned. "That's weird. There's a car back there now. Where did it come from?" I turned around to look. Sure enough, 2 faint headlights shimmered in the distance, growing brighter. "They must have turned onto the highway behind us," I said, shrugging it off. The car drew closer, but something about it felt off. The headlights didn't waver or bounce the way normal car lights do, and the vehicle seemed to glide, closing the distance unnervingly fast. "Okay, that's creepy," Lisa said, sitting up straighter. Mark gripped the steering wheel tighter. "Let's see if they pass us." He slowed the car, but the other vehicle didn't move to overtake us. Instead, it matched our speed, lingering just far enough back that we couldn't make out the driver. "Maybe they're just being cautious," I suggested, though my voice wavered. Mark sped up, and for a moment, I thought we'd lose them. But when I glanced at the rearview mirror, my stomach dropped. The car was still there, keeping perfect pace, as if it were tethered to us. "That's impossible," Mark muttered. "Try taking the next exit," Lisa said, her voice tight. Mark nodded, turning sharply onto a dimly lit side road. The tires squealed, and we all held our breath, waiting to see if the car would follow. For a few seconds, the mirror showed nothing but darkness. Then the headlights appeared again, rounding the corner effortlessly. "This is not normal," Lisa whispered. Mark pushed the gas pedal to the floor, the engine roaring as we raced down the narrow road. Trees blurred past, their shadows dancing across the car's interior. But no matter how fast we went, the other car stayed behind us, its headlights unwavering. I glanced at the mirror and felt my blood run cold. The car wasn't just following, it was closer now, so close that I could almost make out the figure behind the wheel. Almost, but there was no driver. "What is that?" Lisa cried, her voice cracking. "I don't know," Mark shouted, his hands white-knuckled on the wheel. Suddenly, the car's horn blared, a low guttural sound that didn't belong to any vehicle I'd ever heard. It sent chills down my spine, and Lisa screamed, covering her ears. We tore down the road, the horn growing louder, more insistent. Then, as quickly as it started, it stopped. The headlights flickered and vanished, leaving us in total darkness. Mark slowed the car, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "Is it gone?" We all turned to look, but the road behind us was empty. There was no sign of the car, no trace that it had ever been there. "What the hell just happened?" Lisa asked, her voice shaking. None of us had an answer. We drove the rest of the way in silence, every shadow and flicker of light setting us on edge. When we finally reached the motel, Mark parked the car and we all scrambled out, desperate to be anywhere but on the road. But as I walked past the rear of the car, my heart nearly stopped. There, scratched into the dust on the back windshield, were 3 words. "See you soon." We didn't sleep that night. and we haven't driven at night since. The radio signal. It was the perfect night for a road trip. The highway was empty, the moonlight bathed the asphalt in silver, and the air was cool with a hint of fall. Mark drove while I fiddled with the radio, trying to find a decent station. Lisa, in the back seat, dozed off with her hoodie pulled over her head. "You're not seriously going to make me drive in silence, are you?" Mark joked, glancing at me. "Just give me a second," I said, twisting the dial. The static crackled and hissed as I flipped through dead stations. Then, abruptly, a voice cut through the static. "And now, heading west on Route 46, 3 travelers unaware of what's waiting for them around the bend." I froze, my hand still on the dial. "What was that?" Mark asked, frowning. "Probably some weird talk radio," I said, though my voice sounded unconvincing even to myself. I turned the knob again, but no matter which station I tried, the same voice came through, clear and unnerving. "They're listening now," the voice continued, trying to ignore the growing unease in the pit of their stomachs. "But it's too late. The road ahead holds more than just darkness." Mark tightened his grip on the steering wheel, his knuckles white. "This has to be a prank." I didn't respond. My eyes were locked on the radio, the glowing numbers on the display flickering as if the station was unstable. "The driver," the voice said, "is starting to feel the weight of responsibility. He knows he should turn back, but he won't, not yet." Mark's jaw clenched. "Okay, that's enough." He reached over to turn the radio off, but the knob wouldn't budge. "What the hell?" I muttered, trying to help him. Lisa stirred in the back seat, yawning. "What's going on?" Before we could answer, the voice on the radio grew louder, as if the speaker was leaning closer to a microphone. "And the one in the back," it said, "has no idea what's waiting for her. Poor Lisa, always the last to know." Lisa sat up straight, her face pale. "How does it know my name?" None of us had an answer. The broadcast continued, describing every detail of our car: Mark's green hoodie, my chipped nail polish, Lisa's worn-out sneakers. It knew things no one else could possibly know. "The crossroads," the voice said suddenly. "It's coming. Choose wisely or don't choose at all. Either way, they'll be waiting." "What crossroads?" Mark asked, his voice shaking. As if in response, the car's headlights illuminated a fork in the road ahead. The GPS was silent, offering no guidance. "Which way do we go?" Lisa asked, panic rising in her voice. Mark hesitated, glancing between the 2 paths. The road signs were blank, and the darkness beyond either choice seemed to stretch on forever. "Left," the radio whispered, so faint we almost didn't hear it. Mark cursed under his breath. "I'm not listening to that thing." He turned right, and the moment the car veered onto the new path, the radio screeched with static. A high-pitched wail filled the car, making all of us cover our ears. "Wrong choice," the voice hissed, distorted and angry. The headlights flickered, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw something moving in the trees lining the road. Shadows danced, and a figure, tall and thin with glowing eyes, appeared in the rearview mirror. "It's behind us," Lisa whispered, her voice barely audible. Mark floored the gas, the car surging forward. The radio crackled again, the voice now a low, menacing growl. "You can't outrun fate," it said. "We'll meet again." Suddenly, the radio went silent. The car filled with an oppressive stillness as we sped down the road. When we finally reached a well-lit gas station miles later, Mark parked, and we all sat in stunned silence. "Was that real?" Lisa asked, her voice trembling. Mark didn't answer. He turned off the car and got out, his hands shaking. Inside, I glanced back at the radio, now dark and lifeless. But etched into the glass of the screen, as if scratched from the inside, were 3 words. "See you soon." The roadside motel. It was supposed to be a simple road trip. 3 states, 5 days, and countless memories. But by the time we hit the outskirts of nowhere, exhaustion had set in. The rain had started hours earlier, turning the dark highway into a slick ribbon of uncertainty. When the glowing neon sign for Pine Hollow Motel appeared out of the gloom, it felt like a beacon of salvation. The place didn't look great. Peeling paint, flickering lights, and a parking lot dotted with puddles. But it was the only option for miles. "We'll crash here and leave at first light," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. The lobby smelled like damp carpet and stale coffee. Behind the counter stood an elderly man who barely looked up as we checked in. His only words were, "Room 6, don't go wandering." The warning sent a chill down my spine, but I brushed it off. Small-town quirks, I told myself. Room 6 wasn't much better. The bedspread was faded, the wallpaper bubbled at the edges, and a single flickering bulb lit the room. Still, it was dry, and after hours on the road, that was enough. We settled in quickly, with Mark taking the chair by the window, Lisa tossing her bag on the bed, and me inspecting the small bathroom. That's when I noticed it, a crack in the mirror. Strange, jagged, almost like a lightning bolt frozen in glass. "Creepy place," Lisa said, flopping onto the bed. "Just one night," Mark replied, though his eyes lingered on the crack in the mirror. As the hours stretched on, the rain hammered against the window, and the motel seemed to hum with an eerie stillness. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, when I heard it, a faint scratching sound. "Do you hear that?" I whispered. Mark nodded, already on edge. "It's coming from the wall." The sound grew louder, a rhythmic scraping that seemed to travel along the length of the room. Lisa sat up, her face pale. "What is that?" Mark approached the wall, pressing his ear against it. Suddenly the sound stopped. "It's probably just an animal," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. But then, we heard the knock. 3 sharp raps at the door. Mark froze, and I felt my heart leap into my throat. Who would be out in this weather at this hour? "Don't answer it," Lisa whispered, clutching the blanket tightly. Ignoring her, Mark approached the door cautiously. He peered through the peephole, then stepped back, his face pale. "There's no one there," he said. Another knock. Louder this time. Mark yanked the door open, but the hallway was empty. Rain blew in, chilling the air. He shut the door quickly, bolting it. That's when we noticed the writing. Scrawled across the bathroom mirror in what looked like condensation were the words, "Get out." Lisa gasped, backing away. "This place is haunted, I knew it." Before we could respond, the scratching returned, louder and more frantic. This time, it seemed to be coming from under the bed. "No way," I muttered, grabbing the nearest object, a flashlight, and shining it into the darkness beneath the bed. Empty. Then the closet door creaked open. We all froze, staring at the slowly widening gap. Mark approached it cautiously, pulling the door open all the way. The closet was empty too, except for an old coat hanger swinging gently on the rail. "We need to leave," I said, my voice firm. We grabbed our things and bolted for the car, not even stopping to check out. As we pulled out of the lot, I glanced back at the motel. The lights flickered off one by one, leaving the place in complete darkness. The next day, curiosity got the better of me. I searched online for any mention of Pine Hollow Motel. What I found made my blood run cold. The motel had closed down years ago after a series of disappearances. Room 6 was notorious for being the last place any of the victims were seen alive. I shut my laptop, my hands trembling. We were lucky to have left when we did. Whatever secrets that room held, I didn't want to find out. The Shadow Passenger. It was late, and the mountain roads were quieter than we expected. My friends and I had just wrapped up a weekend camping trip, and the drive back was supposed to be uneventful. Miles of twisting roads and the occasional highway sign were our only companions. That was until we hit the tunnel. The tunnel wasn't on the GPS, and none of us remembered passing it on the way there. Still, it was the only way forward. The entrance loomed ahead, its black mouth swallowing the dim glow of our headlights. "This is creepy," Lisa muttered from the back seat, hugging her jacket tightly. "Relax," I said, trying to sound nonchalant as I gripped the steering wheel a little tighter. "It's just a tunnel. We'll be out in a few minutes." The moment we entered, the air seemed heavier, colder. The yellow lights lining the tunnel flickered, casting odd, jittering shadows on the walls. I focused on the road, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. "Did anyone else feel that?" Mark asked from the passenger seat, looking around nervously. "Feel what?" Lisa replied, her voice uneasy. "Like, we're not alone." The car fell into an awkward silence. I glanced in the rearview mirror to check on Lisa, but my eyes caught something else instead. A shadow. It was faint, but unmistakable. A dark shape in the back seat next to Lisa. But there were only 3 of us in the car. "Lisa," I said slowly, trying to keep my voice calm. "Don't freak out, but is there something next to you?" "What? What are you talking about?" she asked, turning to look at the empty seat beside her. I glanced at the mirror again. The shadow was still there. It didn't move, didn't shift. It just lingered. "There's nothing there," Lisa said, her tone wavering. "You're just tired." But Mark had seen it too. "No, there's something in here," he whispered, staring at the mirror with wide eyes. The tunnel stretched on longer than it should have. The light fixtures above flickered more violently, and a low hum began to fill the car, like static but deeper, vibrating in our chests. "Okay, this isn't normal," Lisa said, her voice rising. "How long is this tunnel?" "I don't know," I snapped, panic creeping into my voice. The odometer suggested we'd already traveled farther than the tunnel should have stretched. The shadow in the back seat began to shift. Slowly, it leaned forward, its outline growing sharper in the dim light. My breath hitched as I realized it was shaped like a person, head, shoulders, and arms, but entirely black, like a void. "Don't look at it," Mark said, his voice shaking. "Just keep driving, don't stop." Lisa whimpered, squeezing her eyes shut. "This isn't happening. This isn't real." I pressed down on the gas, my foot trembling. The tunnel's end was nowhere in sight, and the hum grew louder, almost deafening. The shadow moved again, this time stretching its arm toward Lisa. "Get it away from me," she screamed, scooting as far as she could toward the door. "Hold on," I yelled, slamming my hand against the horn. The blaring sound echoed violently in the tunnel, and for a moment the shadow recoiled. Suddenly, a bright light appeared ahead, the tunnel's exit. "Drive!" Mark shouted. I floored it, the engine roaring as we sped toward the light. The shadow clung to the back seat, its form warping as if it were being pulled in 2 directions. As soon as we burst out of the tunnel, everything stopped. The shadow was gone. The hum vanished. The air felt normal again. I pulled over to the side of the road, my hands trembling on the wheel. Lisa scrambled out of the car, gasping for air. Mark and I followed, too shaken to speak. When we finally worked up the courage to look back at the tunnel, we realized something chilling. It wasn't there. The road behind us was empty, no sign of the yawning darkness we'd just escaped, only an unbroken stretch of asphalt winding through the mountains. We didn't say much for the rest of the drive, but the silence spoke volumes. Whatever had joined us in that tunnel hadn't been meant to leave, and now I avoid tunnels whenever I can. The roadkill curse. It was supposed to be an easy drive back home after a weekend getaway. The roads were quiet, the air crisp, and the stars blanketed the sky in a way only the countryside could offer. My friends and I were tired but content, chatting lazily as the car hummed along the winding back roads. Then it happened. A blur darted out from the side of the road. I slammed on the brakes, but it was too late. The sickening thud of impact jolted the car, silencing everyone inside. "Did we hit something?" Sarah whispered from the back seat, her voice barely audible. I nodded, gripping the wheel tightly, my knuckles white. "Yeah, I think it was an animal." We all got out to check. Lying in the road was a large animal. A fox, maybe. Its body was still, but its eyes seemed wide open, almost accusing. "Poor thing," Alex said, his face pale. "We should move it off the road." Reluctantly, we did. Sarah covered it with a blanket we had in the trunk, while Alex and I carefully carried it to the grass. As we turned to leave, I could have sworn I heard a faint growl, low and guttural, but that was impossible. It was dead. Back in the car, the atmosphere had shifted. The once light-hearted chatter was replaced by a heavy silence. Even the music from the radio felt out of place, so I turned it off. That's when the strange things began. At first, it was subtle. The headlights flickered, casting odd shadows on the road. The air inside the car grew colder, enough to make Sarah shiver. Then, we noticed the scratches. "Did you see that?" Alex asked, pointing at the windshield. "What?" I glanced at the glass. Faint streaks like claw marks marred the surface. "You didn't see those before, right?" Sarah asked nervously, her voice trembling. I shook my head. "Number they weren't there." We pressed on, trying to ignore the unease creeping into our minds. But the further we drove, the worse it got. Shadows flickered in the trees along the roadside, darting and weaving as if something was keeping pace with the car. Sarah gasped. "Look!" A set of glowing eyes appeared in the rearview mirror, low to the ground, following us. "Is that another animal?" Alex asked, his voice shaking. "No way," I said, stepping on the gas. The eyes didn't waver, keeping pace with us no matter how fast I drove. Then the radio crackled to life on its own. A deep, distorted voice filled the car, speaking in a language none of us understood. The sound was deafening, pressing down on us like a weight. "Turn it off!" Sarah screamed. I fumbled with the dial, but it wouldn't budge. The voice grew louder, angrier. Suddenly, the car swerved as if something had hit it from the side. "What was that?" Alex yelled, clutching the door. "I don't know," I shouted back, fighting to keep the car on the road. Ahead, the road seemed to shift, twisting unnaturally. The trees closed in, their branches clawing at the windows like desperate hands. The glowing eyes were now everywhere, surrounding us, closing in. "We have to stop," Sarah cried. I slammed on the brakes, skidding to a halt in the middle of the road. The silence that followed was deafening. We sat there, panting, too terrified to speak. Then, slowly, the radio cut out, and the scratches on the windshield faded. The air grew warmer, and the glowing eyes vanished. I turned to Alex and Sarah. "We're leaving. Now." They nodded, and I hit the gas, driving as fast as I could without looking back. When we finally made it to a main road, the tension eased, but the guilt lingered. I don't know what we disturbed that night, but it felt like a warning, a reminder that some things should never be taken lightly. And now, whenever I drive through the countryside, I'm extra cautious because I know what happens when you're not.